The next session is on the hierarchy of evidence. So in medicine, when we make decisions about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing, we're a bit nerdy about what we need to say this is safe and we should do it. And we like randomized controlled trials, and we like to have the science put out in front of us. And of course, this is one of the major oppositions to the wide rollout of medicinal cannabis. We're going to get into that a little bit, I hope. Mark, do you think that we should be giving some special dispensation to medicinal cannabis so that it doesn't all have to have multiple double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials before we use it in patients? Is there something special about cannabis that allows it off the hook?
No, I don't think there's anything particularly special that would absolve it from having to meet the tests of scientific rigor that we would normally want to see for any product that we're going to sell and tell people to take. The difference is that the classical system of randomized trials and evidence-based medicine was really built around single-agent new chemical entities, pharmaceutical products. The whole system was born out of the thalidomide crisis, when, of course, this was an unregulated drug in the early 1960s, caused some horrendous birth defects, and as a result of that, put into place a system to monitor drug development so that these kinds of issues would be prevented when you bring a new chemical into the market. The difference with cannabis, of course, is its long history of use and its relative safety profile, and the fact that it's a complex mixture, as Dedi pointed out this morning, of all these kinds. And that doesn't always fit easily into the single-agent RCT drug development model. So maybe there are some tweaks, maybe there are some ways to understand and accept how that's done. Sativex did it very well. They were able to make a complex botanical into a prescription medicine. So no, I don't think it needs to be absolved from meeting the criteria of science. And if cannabis is half as good as everyone thinks it is, it should pass those tests with flying colors. So I don't think we should be any special. So I'll stop there.
Ethan, so in Israel, you've seen this unusual situation where medicinal cannabis has been rolled out in parallel to clinical trials that are occurring. Should the medicinal application and implementation of cannabis await until all the trials are done, or is there a benefit to running the two in parallel?
Well, I think it has to be in parallel. Irrespective of what the regulators might wish, people are using this material anyway. I think that, to me, it's clear that there are always going to be three different types of cannabis. Ultimately, there'll be a few pharmaceutical products where some company has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to get it through the regulatory process. At the same time, there'll be what we'll call herbal forms of cannabis that might be supplements that should be subject to some level of proof, clearly of safety and efficacy and quality, but that haven't had to go through phase 1 to 3 randomized controlled trials. And then there'll be garden variety cannabis or artisanal preparations where people will grow it on their own or get it from someone who does. We have a situation, though, that there's a lot of data coming out that is simply observational, and people have to understand that while this might be convincing to them personally, and it is important, does point the way, it will not pass muster with regulators, and it really does not advance the cause for most physicians who remain either ignorant or skeptical of the literature. So to get more people on board, we do require this higher level of evidence. And there's some real challenges there.
Yeah. Nadia, we've heard from Ethan, who suggested that it's possible to run rigorous randomized controlled trials in parallel with people getting on and using it for benefit. In Australia, there is frequently voiced an opinion that letting people use medicinal cannabis for their medicinal gain will actually interfere with trials. Where do you stand on that position?
Myself personally, or myself as representing ACRE? Because I think those are two different things, if I can...
Well, you can articulate both if you want.
Sure. So I am here representing ACRE, which is the Australian Centre for Cannabinoid Clinical and Research Excellence funded by the NHMRC, and I'm co-director of this centre. But the centre comprises more than 20 academic researchers and clinicians, all of whom may have different views on this matter, but we do all bind together in our mission to bring safety and efficacy to medicinal cannabis in Australia. So from my own perspective, I'm not sure that I believe entirely in this hierarchy of evidence and needing to always meet that. Of course, we do need to provide evidence that will convince the regulators. However, clinical trials may be the gold standard, but they don't take into account the enormous heterogeneity of symptoms that patients experience, nor the individual differences in terms of response to different cannabinoid profiles. So absolutely, we need to listen to the critical stories told by patients, success stories and failures. We need to hear and learn from the lived experience of patients. And we also need to somehow harness that in better ways, including the entire history of what we have learned over the centuries. And I absolutely support the right to try. But I think that until we can change the system, we absolutely need to also continue the research to gain further evidence to convince the regulators to change the system. So we need more observational studies, we need N=1 trials, we need mechanistic studies, preclinical animal studies. And I think that sometimes different elements within this research space are kind of competing or fighting against each other, and that's not going to get us anywhere. But instead, if we all band together and contribute our individual skills and collaborate in a greater sense, we can actually change this beast.
Yeah, it's a good answer. I like that. Someone else now, we keep on hearing this thing, this N=1. What is that nonsense? Who wants to tell me what N=1? Laurie, tell me what that means.
N=1 means really finding out what an individual patient needs for whatever reason they need it. And it doesn't mean a top-down approach, it means a bottom-up approach when the patient decides what they need. I come from the anesthesia and pain medicine area where post-operative pain was an issue. During the 1960s, we used to talk about tight-fisted analgesia, where patients in post-operative rooms would be screaming their heads off or they'd be bombed to the eyeballs with their standard 10 milligrams of morphine every 4 hours. And we got to the idea of working out why this is the case. And during the 1970s, the International Association for the Study of Pain was born, and it brought together researchers with all different reasons for wanting to study pain. Anatomists, physiologists, pharmacologists, clinicians of various ilks, and as well as nursing and other staff. And with this combined approach, we started to learn that the patients can be indeed very, very individual in how much they need, even after the same surgery and ostensibly the same sort of patient. And so with the model of patient-controlled analgesia that evolved during the 1980s from these sorts of studies of allowing patients to dose themselves till they felt they had enough medication to relieve their pain, or not enough, or so much that they really didn't want any more for whatever reason, the individual patient was catered for. And the same philosophy can be entirely applied to cannabis and has been applied in many cases. A colleague of mine in Britain, Willie Notcutt, who did a lot of work initially with GW Pharma, was one of the pioneers of this area. And so letting a patient decide what was good for them and under what circumstances is the end of one model. And this is really what's being embraced with this new age of personalised medicine. After all, that's what we're trying to do. Even now, we're trying to incorporate genetic things and as well as biological things in other ways into our medicine. So the ultimate goal of personalised medicine is what that patient needs for them, and whether it's a particular blend, in this case, of cannabinoids and other things, because it's a much more complicated thing than morphine or pethidine or fentanyl that we were using for post-operative pain, because it's got all these other things with it. And so the end of one model is really putting the patient at the center rather than the trial, the goal at the center. You know, after all, a randomized controlled trial, placebo-controlled, whatever, is a very blunt instrument. Very, very blunt indeed, that concentrates on the central tendency and not on the individuals that are involved. And that's why that whole model of the randomized clinical trial, and even worse, the meta-analysis of randomized clinical trials, dumps everything into the center and not investigating the individuals who are the recipients of the treatment.
Thank you for that. So, Mark and Ethan, is there, from an industry perspective, is there any interest in running large N=1 trials? Is that something we don't see a lot of?
Well, you know, as Laurie mentioned, the original studies clinically on the GW program were N=1, and it was done in a very clever way. The studies that Willie Nutcutt did in pain and Phil Robson did in MS and other neurological symptoms went through a sequence. Basically, the patient was said, you will get one of a variety of medicines. You won't know what it is. We won't know what it is until afterwards. So they had 4 arms, typically. First was a spray in the mouth of a high THC extract. Then another was a high CBD extract. The third was the two together, what we now know as Sativex, and the fourth was placebo. And the patient would get one of these preparations every 2 weeks and then go on to the next, and it was double-blind, as I mentioned. And they monitored symptoms during this, and afterwards it was quite easy to tell what worked best for any individual. And the results were interesting. In general, the 1-to-1 THC to CBD, Sativex, was most effective for the most things and had a good side effect profile. The high THC worked for a lot of things, a few more side effects. The CBD only, interestingly, worked best in neuropathic pain for a small subset of people, and placebo responses were generally lower, but significant. After all this, the patients were allowed to continue on the preparation of choice, and so there was some subsequent long-term extension data on it. And it's always been curious to me that we assume that THC is better for neuropathic pain, but there were the small subset of individuals that preferred CBD. And I had occasion to talk to some of these patients, and in one instance, this fellow had been on it for 5 years, and it was the first thing that had controlled his pain. And this is after everyone had cycled through every other available medicine. You never got into a trial at GW before you'd failed every conventional medicine. Unfortunately, the N=1 model is not accepted by regulators, at least not the US FDA. And we're stuck with these placebo-controlled trials, but that approach is failing. Over the last 30 years, we've had a marked increase with placebo responses, and it's gotten to the point that even a good drug cannot demarcate itself from placebo in a statistically significant fashion. And it's worse for conditions where we're using subjective measures. In other words, the patient tells you it's pain. We don't put a pain meter on their forehead and get a readout. We're not there yet. Additionally, if the drug is psychoactive, placebo responses are sky high. And if, God forbid, the medicine that they hope they're receiving is perceived as miraculous by the patient, which is true of cannabis now, wrongly, but that leads to phenomenal placebo responses. So there's some real challenges in the current paradigm, and I would like to see the N=1 model be available as a path towards regulatory approval.
Michelle, I agree. So there's some terribly bright. The people who've just spoken in front of me here are far brighter than me. There's terribly bright and wise people talking about trials and the ways to do trials. And does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, our story's quite a long one, so
You have all the time you need.
N1 studies, or what I know as, or refer to as precision medicine, I think really is something that needs to be put in place by medical specialists for complex children like my son. Jai's story in a nutshell, he was diagnosed with epilepsy 2010, and he was put on a lot of AEDs. At his worst, 5 AEDs, 30 tablets a day. Exhausted the spectrum of medications quite quickly, and we then realised that we had no other options left. Everything was getting worse. He went on a microdose amounts of THCA, which I sourced on the black market. Seizures ceased. In that meantime, he'd already exhausted literally well over 20 medications. We had a lot of EEGs prior that showed what pharmaceuticals were doing and what they weren't doing, and then the side effects. And so, we had 3 EEGs on the THCA, and his EEGs were tidy. They were clear and they were clean. And then he remained that way and seizure-free for 2 years, and we got an off batch. And that nearly resulted in Jai's life ending. So he ended up in resus, had the most brutal tonic-clonic, and we were forced back on pharmaceuticals that we'd used before that had failed. And he ended up resus code 1, over and over again for months, got approved for Epidiolex, and eventually, because he was knocked back twice because he wasn't in hospital, because he was seizure-free on an unregulated product. So eventually got that, and within a couple of months he was in ED with severe poisoning from the Epidiolex. So that was ceased, and we were left with nothing again. Jai's inoperable, 3 rare types of epilepsy. So I kept saying precision medicine. I don't know why it worked. I don't know why we had the 3 clear EGs, but it worked, and it worked well for Jai. I don't know why. I just knew that it was the only thing that did help. So anyway, after the Epidiolex had failed, poisoning, resuscitated again, we had to wait months again, and it wasn't, it wasn't just a small couple of months here and there. Literally, over a period of well over a year and a half, until we now got a product that is CBD dominant. It's very much a sister drug of Epidiolex, and he's started that and got approval for that in October last year. By November, he was seizure-free. But that was because I also, instead of doing the BD doses, I knew what worked with the unregulated, and it was small but more frequent. He has that at school. He has multiple doses. But his EEG's on this. We're now, I think, EEG number 62 over, the 10-year or 9-year period. So we have the evidence that says what worked, what didn't work, but no one can explain it. And now we've had an EEG that's definitely shown he's had at least 50% reduction in activity. He's doing great, but it's still not what we were at. So, why aren't they? Why are we being refused the M1 studies? Why aren't we looking into these complex cases? I believe it comes down to money. I believe it comes down to the unknown. They're not eager to get on board. They'd rather shine away from it because they're more comfortable prescribing pharmaceuticals. Jai's been on that much and has, literally 35 tablets a day for a child of 8 years old. He was wheelchair bound, he was nasal gastric fed, he's had that many surgeries, and he has forever permanent complications and side effects from their treatment that all failed him. And now we have it in writing that cannabis therapy will only be his medicine of the future, which is a win. We now have it in writing that he can have multiple doses, but the best thing is what's noted by the whole medical team is that it's done no harm. It's the first medication that they've been able to prescribe that's done no harm. So, you know, I don't know. I'm just a mum of Jai, and I'm working with the specialists because I believe that's the only way as well to make change. And we have a lot of nurses that are advocating, as well as a lot of good doctors and good people, but it's just not happening fast enough. We shouldn't have waited months. We shouldn't have had to have gone to resus when they had that evidence for, you know, good 2 years of 3 EEGs, which said it worked, but no one could explain why.
I might take this opportunity now to open it to the floor. Does anybody have any questions for the panel regarding evidence and regulation? And yes, sir.
I'd like to ask Mark, are you planning or are you already working on setting up a patient self-reporting system for Canopy?
So the question was, are we planning as Canopy to set up patient self-reporting mechanisms? I've been advocating for this for years, so long before Canopy, setting up patient registries, open label studies. There's a tendency towards accepting, and Ethan mentioned that the N of 1 model's not recognized by regulators, but one thing they are recognizing is something called real-world evidence. And real-world evidence is actually becoming a thing for the FDA to accept these kinds of observational studies, the kinds that Nadia was talking about, the single patient experiences. If you collect that in a systematic way, it becomes something called real-world data, and then if you assemble that and analyze it and interpret it, it becomes real-world evidence. It actually becomes something that regulators will look at as part of a submission with the trial data and everything else. So I think this is really important to do, and it does get away from some of the limitations of the clinical trial, which was pointed out as has its own limitations. It's very nice for testing a hypothesis, but doesn't really generalize well. So yes, by all means, I think I and we are very interested in this kind of real-world evidence as an approach to understanding cannabis therapy.
Any other questions? So I think on that note, we are going to call it a day.